Mara wife 16 sol, se marihui thi. Main kuda, uska genaza dekatha, kali tabut, defnia tha, or apni bedia kila palatha. 16 solbod, jab main apni garage main kam kar. Rahatha, wodawaza, kolkar, ander ayi, ika janabi lark, kasoth. Uski anka, main wahi paranikov, tha jo main shadika, peldinen, main dekatha. Usun, sari nahi kaha. Usun surf itna kaha, hamari paz wak nahi hai. Police ko, mat balana. Mujas wak, samaj nahi, iake, the raz, the jute, or the masum larka. Mir purgar ko, ander se hiladega, wo kisi bi debahi. Wo kisi bi debahi, se ziada kaufnak tha. I had a wife who's been dead for 16 years. I buried an empty casket for her, raised our daughter by myself. And somewhere around year 12, I finally stopped flinching every time a woman with her hair color walked into my shop. So when she walked through my garage door on a random Tuesday afternoon with a teenage boy standing half behind her, I genuinely thought I was having some kind of stroke. I remember the smell of brake cleaner in the air, a radio playing some classic rock station low in the background, and then her voice, which I hadn't heard in 16 years, cutting through all of it like nothing had changed. She didn't say sorry. She didn't cry. She said, "We don't have much time. I need you to not call the police." Then she looked down at the boy beside her and said his name was Sam, like that was supposed to mean something to me. I want to tell you, I handled that moment with some kind of grace. I dropped a torque wrench square on my own foot and just stood there, staring at a woman I'd mourned for over a decade, standing very much alive in my garage. Wondering if I was finally losing my mind after all these years alone. I'm 52 years old. I run a small auto shop in a town in Ohio that used to have a decent-sized parts factory and doesn't anymore. Most of my business these days is oil changes, brake jobs, and the occasional transmission rebuild for guys who can't afford a new car and won't be able to for a long time, maybe ever. It's honest work. It pays the bills most months. Some months it doesn't, and I eat into savings I don't really have anymore. My daughter Casey is 26 now. I raised her mostly alone, starting when she was 10. After her mother Ellen supposedly drove off a bridge access road late one night and never made it home. They found her car 3 days later, wedged into some brush along the riverbank, driver's door open, no sign of her. They found what they told me was her body about a week after that, badly decomposed from the water, matched through dental records by the county examiner. I had a funeral. I bought a headstone. I spent close to 4 years so numb, I barely remember big chunks of Casey's middle school years, and I've never really forgiven myself for that, even though everyone in my life at the time told me grief doesn't run on anybody's schedule. Ellen worked as a quality control engineer at Halbrook Automotive, a parts supplier about 40 minutes outside of town. I never fully understood the specifics of what she did there. I fix cars for a living. She designed the standards that decided whether parts were even allowed to go into cars in the first place. Different worlds, same industry, and we used to joke about that at dinner, about how she made the rules and I just tried to keep old machines running within them. So when she reappeared standing in my garage, older, thinner, clearly scared out of her mind, my first stupid thought wasn't how or why. It was, God help me, who's this kid, and is he mine? I know how that sounds. I'm not proud of it. But 16 years does strange things to a man's first instincts. He wasn't mine. Ellen must have seen the question written all over my face because she said, fast, almost tripping over her own words, "He's not yours. Mark, he's not mine either, biologically. It's complicated. Please, can we just go somewhere and talk? Not here." The boy, Sam, stepped forward then and held out a small, external hard drive, like he was handing me a hall pass to homeroom. Mom said, "You fix transmissions," he said, real steady for a kid his age. She said you'd know what to do with this, in case something happened to her. That sentence sat with me for days afterward. Not in case something happens. Past tense readiness. Like this whole thing had already been decided a long time ago. Like this kid had been raised his entire life, knowing a day like this might come and he'd need to hand a stranger a hard drive and trust him with it. I shut the shop early that day. First time in years I've done that outside of a holiday. We drove to my house, the same one Casey grew up in, Same kitchen table we'd had since before Ellen disappeared. And I sat across from my dead wife like it was any other Tuesday evening. Sam sat quiet in the living room, flipping through an old car magazine like he'd been trained to make himself invisible in unfamiliar houses. Ellen told me pieces that first night, not everything, not close to everything. She said that 16 years ago she'd found a defect in a braking component Halbrook was shipping out to several manufacturers, something that failed under specific heat and pressure conditions that weren't part of standard testing, she said when she raised it internally through the proper channels. She got told to document it and let legal handle it quietly. She said she didn't let it go. She said things got dangerous faster than she ever expected, and that the people who could make her disappear a lot more permanently than a staged accident made it very clear that vanishing on her own terms was somehow the safer option on the table. I asked her, so the body they found, whose was that? She wouldn't answer that first night. She just looked at me and said, I need you to trust me for a little while before I can answer everything. I know that's not fair to ask of you. It wasn't fair. But I let her and Sam stay in the guest room anyway, because whatever anger was building underneath my ribs, I still had 16 years of missing her sitting right below it, and I wasn't ready to sort out which feeling was actually in charge. That night, after they'd both gone to sleep, I dug the old case file box out of my closet. The one with the police report and the insurance paperwork from her death, the one I hadn't opened in probably 6 or 7 years. The dental records were right there in black and white. An official positive match, signed off by the county medical examiner, notarized, stamped, filed. That wasn't a woman just walking away from her life one night. Faking a confirmed dental identification takes someone with real institutional reach. That scared me a lot more than Ellen reappearing alive ever could, because it meant, whatever this was, it went a lot higher up than one scared engineer. The next gut punch came from somewhere I genuinely didn't expect. My daughter Casey has been engaged for about 1.5 years to a guy named Doug. Decent, quiet, a little too serious sometimes, works as a compliance auditor. At Halbrook Automotive, same company. I'd known that fact for 2 years and never once thought twice about it, because half this town has worked there in some capacity at some point. Now it felt like the walls of my whole life had been quietly rearranged around me, without my ever noticing the renovation happening. A few days later, I plugged Sam's hard drive into an old laptop in the back office, half expecting some dramatic reveal, some smoking gun email. Instead, I found dry technical documents, test result spreadsheets, internal memos, all time-stamped from 16 years back. Not new information at all. Old information, perfectly preserved, uncorrupted. Like someone had been quietly keeping it alive and untouched on some backup drive for over a decade, waiting for the right moment. I asked Ellen point blank the next morning over coffee, who's been holding on to this the whole time. He didn't carry a laptop around for 16 years running from people. She was quiet a moment, stirring sugar into a mug she barely drank from. Then she said there'd been someone else. A colleague of hers back then, an engineer named Priya Nair, who'd raised nearly identical concerns around the exact same time, who officially died in a car accident that same year, a few months before Elon's own accident. 2 women. 2 convenient deaths. 1 company. Sat with that for a long time, staring at my own coffee going cold. We had Casey and Doug over for dinner about a week after Ellen showed up, though I'll admit I hadn't fully planned on springing Sam and Ellen on them the way it happened. Casey found out her mother was alive from a neighbor before I got the chance to tell her properly myself, and I wasn't about to hide her own mother in my guest room like some shameful secret. It was an ugly, stiff, mostly silent meal. Casey barely looked at Ellen the entire time, just kept cutting her chicken into smaller and smaller pieces she never actually ate. Then Doug looked across the table at Sam, really looked at him, and went pale in a way I'll remember for the rest of my life. I've seen his face before, Doug said quietly, setting his fork down. In an old personnel file. It's a different last name attached to it, though. There was a flag on it. Next of kin. Do not contact. He looked almost sick, saying it out loud. Said he hadn't understood why that flag existed when he first came across it doing an internal audit close to a year earlier. Now, sitting at this table, he understood exactly why. I hired a lawyer not long after that dinner, a guy 2 towns over who specialized in employment and whistleblower law. Ellen was terrified of doing anything official, kept saying it was too soon, too risky. But I told her hiding forever wasn't a plan, it was just delaying whatever was coming anyway. 3 weeks into working with him, he called and dropped the case, citing a vague conflict of interest. Took me exactly one phone call to a friend in the county clerk's office to learn his firm did steady contract work for Halbrook's parent holding company. The one system supposed to protect us was already quietly compromised from the inside. That's when Ellen finally told me the whole truth, sitting out on my back porch close to 11 at night, because she said she couldn't say any of it sitting inside the house. The defect she'd found hadn't just been sitting harmlessly on some shelf somewhere waiting to be caught. It had already caused a crash. A family had lost a child because of it. Halbrook had quietly settled with that family under a strict non-disclosure agreement to keep the whole thing out of court records and out of the local papers. Sam was that family's second child, born a couple years after the settlement, and when his parents started facing quiet, ongoing pressure to stay silent permanently, not just about the crash, but about a pattern of similar failures the company was still sitting on, they made a desperate, careful arrangement with Ellen. Someone they'd come to trust through her own investigation into the case, to raise him somewhere else entirely. Ellen hadn't spent 16 years hiding herself. She'd spent 16 years hiding him. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept picturing this kid, raised his whole life essentially as a corporation's loose end, tucked away somewhere quiet so nobody important would ever have to answer for what happened to his brother or sister. Around that same stretch of time, I found something buried in my own shop's old service logs that turned my stomach over. A Halbrook fleet vehicle, serviced right here at my garage a little over 10 years back. Logged under an employee name I didn't recognize and never had a face to put with it. My own business had been used at some point, without my knowledge or consent. Possibly just so somebody could keep a quiet, casual eye on my family, without Ellen ever knowing her old company still had eyes this close. Not long after that discovery, a woman called my shop's landline, asking for Ellen's husband by name, not by the shop's name, by my actual name. It was Priya, not dead at all, living 2 states away under a completely different identity. Absolutely terrified that Ellen resurfacing had put both of them back on somebody's radar after over a decade of careful silence. Casey struggled the most through all of this, more than any of us, I think. She loved her mother and resented her in the exact same breath. And on top of all that, she was scared about what this whole mess meant for Doug's job, for their upcoming wedding, for the life she'd spent years quietly building for herself. One night late, she sat Doug down at their apartment and asked him flat out whether he'd known any piece of this before Sam ever showed up at our table. He told her honestly that he'd been quietly pulling and photographing old internal fleet documents for over a year because something about the record keeping never sat right with him. Said he just never in 100 years imagined it would eventually lead back to his own future mother-in-law. 2 weeks after that conversation, somebody broke into my shop overnight. Nothing was stolen. The security footage from that entire week was wiped clean, and one specific filing cabinet, the one holding that old fleet service record I'd found, was simply gone. Nothing else in the shop was touched. Not the tools, not the register, nothing. That's when it really hit me that whatever this whole thing was, it wasn't 16 years buried safely in the past anymore. Somebody was watching right now in real time, close enough to know exactly which filing cabinet mattered. Through Priya, we finally learned the piece that reframed everything for me. The piece that made me stop thinking about this as one evil company and start thinking about it as something a lot more ordinary and a lot more disappointing. This hadn't just been a company hiding a defect and making people disappear out of pure malice. There had actually been a legitimate privately brokered protection arrangement, set up quietly years earlier through Halbrook's own insurer, meant to relocate and financially support both women once they agreed to stay quiet about what they knew. It was real for a while. Payments came. Contact was maintained through a third party. But once the statute of limitations on the original defect started looking safe from Halbrook's side, somebody simply let the arrangement lapse. Support was cut off. Files were buried deep in some records room. 2 women and a teenage boy were left exposed without a single warning, purely because it had become cheaper on a spreadsheet to abandon a promise than to keep quietly funding it. That part made me angrier than anything else in this whole situation, if I'm being honest. Not because it was dramatic or shocking in some movie way, because it was so plain and ordinary. It was just people doing quiet math with other people's lives and deciding the math no longer favored keeping their word. When we finally moved forward with everything we had, Doug's internal documents, Sam's old hard drive, Priya's willingness to give a statement, Halbrook's legal team didn't fight us the way I fully expected them to. Within about a week, they offered Ellen and Priya a private settlement, a genuinely significant one, tied tightly to a strict non-disclosure agreement. Won't pretend I wasn't tempted. Sitting at that kitchen table, looking at a number that could clear every bit of debt this shop has quietly carried for close to a decade, it was tempting in a way that made me feel a little ashamed of myself. Ellen looked exhausted enough that I honestly would have understood if she'd just signed it and let us all disappear into a comfortable, quiet life somewhere new. She didn't sign it. She said if she took that money and that silence, she'd be doing to some other family, somewhere down the line, exactly what had already been done to hers. So instead of taking the settlement, we went the slower, riskier route. Doug's documents went to a state regulator and a local investigative reporter on the very same day. So nobody could quietly make the whole thing disappear through one compromised channel. It wasn't the kind of ending you see in a movie. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no gavel, no crowd outside a courthouse. The state ended up finding Halbrook, a real number, but nowhere close to life-changing for a company that size. And Halbrook put out a short public statement about renewed commitment to safety protocols that barely even acknowledged what had actually happened over the years. Ellen and Priya didn't end up rich. Doug somehow kept his job, mostly because he'd stayed technically within proper internal channels the whole time he'd been quietly documenting things. What we did get out of it all was smaller than real justice, but a whole lot bigger than nothing. We got to sit around one table, all of us, without anybody hiding anything from anybody else anymore. Casey and her mother are still rebuilding something between them, slowly, carefully. The way you'd rebuild an engine you don't fully trust yet, even after you've replaced every worn part. Sam ended up staying with us. He calls me Mark, not Dad. And honestly, that feels exactly right for both of us. No pressure attached to it either way. He's 17 now and says he wants to study mechanical engineering. And yeah, I notice the irony of that every single day I open the shop. I think about those 16 years a lot, more than I probably let on to anyone, about whether Ellen made the right call disappearing instead of fighting it all out in the open back then, whatever the cost. I used to believe there was no version of that choice I could ever forgive her for. I'm honestly not so sure anymore. She was protecting a kid who wasn't even biologically hers, from people with more money and more power than either of us will ever have in our lifetimes. I still don't know for certain if I'd have made the same choice in her position. I like to believe I would have stayed and fought instead of vanishing. But I've never actually had to choose between protecting a child and staying honest with the people who love me. So maybe that's an easy thing to say sitting comfortably on this side of it. What would you have done in her place? I'm still not sure I've forgiven her completely, and I'm still not sure I even need to in order to keep moving forward with her in my life. Just curious how the rest of you would have handled something like this.